Okay, hello Year 7. What I'd like to look at today is the Spanish Armada, and I want to look at why did it fail. So that's the main focus of the lesson, is to examine why the Spanish Armada failed. And in order to do that, I'm going to go through this PowerPoint and discuss some of the main reasons why the Spanish Armada failed. Now, this will form the final part of the work you're doing for your BBC History magazine that you're writing your article for. So you've got an introduction where you'll talk, just briefly introduce the reasons why the Spanish Armada set off. You've then got the events of the Armada, and at the end you'll see a part on the reasons why it's failed. And that's what I want to talk about in today's lesson. So if we just start going through the PowerPoint, I can start talking about some of the main reasons. Now, one reason it failed is because of bad weather. And it's actually not just the weather that we've looked at already in the Great Storm, the Great Gale that blew when they left Calais, but actually the Armada ran into bad weather right from the start. If you look down here, when they set off from Lisbon in May, they actually encountered a storm straight away. And actually what this meant is that many of the ships were damaged and they had to put into port here in Coruña. So they hadn't even left Spanish waters and they were already having to put into another port for repairs. So we can see bad weather is a factor right from the beginning. Now, if we move on, we can then talk about some of the skill of the English, some of the things the English did well. And what they did is when the Armada was sighted on the 20th of July off Lizard Point in Cornwall, in order to get the message to London, the English lit beacons along the southern coast. So these were flaming beacons that each point would light their beacon, then that would be seen on the next one, they would then light another beacon and so on and so forth, all the way along the coast. And this got the message to London very quickly. Let's look at the next bit. Now, as the Armada travelled up the channel here, you can see the Armada travelling up the English Channel. They were actually in a very safe formation. They were in a crescent formation, so shaped like a kind of crescent moon. And this was a defensive formation that was very effective for defending against English attacks. Now, the English fleet had been stuck in Plymouth, and although they came out and tried to pick off some of the Spanish ships, it was very ineffective. So effectively, the Spanish Armada in this safe defensive crescent formation moved up the channel fairly unchallenged and undamaged. Now, their destination was Calais. Now, one thing to bear in mind is the differences in the ships of the two sides. Now, I would like to suggest to you that one of the reasons for the Spanish Armada's failure was the superiority of the English ships. The English ships were better. They were better for the type of fighting that they were involved in. They were better for the type of waters, the waters around England that they were sailing in. So, firstly, the English ships were smaller and faster. They were more manoeuvrable and their guns could fire further. So the English ships sat slightly lower in the water. They were smaller, but this meant they could move more easily. They were faster, so they could evade any Spanish ships that were trying to attack them. Now, Spanish ships were designed for the Mediterranean. Now, if anyone's been on holiday in the Mediterranean, you'll know the waves aren't as big when you're in the Mediterranean because it's kind of a landlocked sea. So the Spanish ships were better in flatter seas. They were not so good in the rougher seas around England. It's also worth bearing in mind the English sailors were more experienced and better. The sailors were actually better at sailing. The other thing to bear in mind is that the Spanish ships were designed with high castles at the back. Now their method of attack was to sail up alongside an English ship or an enemy ship, whoever it may be, and use grappling hooks to bring the ship aside, and then the idea was to use soldiers to board the enemy vessel and then kind of fight a land battle on the ship. Well, the English wouldn't let them do this. The English kept their distance. They used their manoeuvrable ships and their better guns to try and pick off the Spanish. Now, we move on to the guns. Now, what we see here is some of the differences between the English and the Spanish guns. Now, this is an English cannon and a Spanish cannon. Here, the bigger one is Spanish. Now, you might think, whoa, the bigger one's going to be better, but actually, it wasn't. These guns here, the English guns, are designed for ships. Now, they could fire further and more rapidly. So although the cannonballs aren't as big, they're more accurate, they can fire further, and the English sailors were very well trained at firing very quickly. The Spanish guns, on the other hand, were slower to load. They had a variety of different cannons. In fact, the Spanish had brought on board many cannons that were just used on land. And what this meant was that because they had a variety of different cannons, some of the cannonballs didn't fit in the holes, some of the cannons rolled around on the ships, and they just simply weren't as effective as the English guns. So, we've got two reasons here. The English ships were superior, but also their guns. Now, the Armada then laid anchor in Calais, and we have a very important event here, don't we? Which, hands up, who knows what happened at Calais? If this was a classroom, I'm sure all those hands would be going up, and you would all be shouting out to me. You'd all be shouting out to me the fact that the Spanish hadn't got a suitable plan to pick up the troops, and the Duke of Parma was not ready. So when they laid anchor in Calais, expecting to pick up the troops that were there from the Duke of Parma, he was nowhere to be seen. So this left the Spanish Armada at anchor in Calais and vulnerable to attack. So what did the English do? They sent in fire ships. You'd all be shouting this out, I'm sure, if we were in a classroom. They sent in fire ships to attack the Spanish. Now, we think it's about 8 ships were loaded with tar, rope, flammable material. These old ships were then set to drift towards the Spanish, and they drifted into the harbour, and the Spanish panicked. And this is a crucial moment. They panicked, they cut their anchors, and they sailed off into the English Channel. Now, the crucial thing here is they lost their crescent formation. This crescent formation that they'd had up the channel, which was very defensively orientated and very hard to attack, was now broken. The English could pick off individual Spanish ships. So they then moved slightly north, and off the coast of Holland there's a place called Gravelines, and we then have the major battle of this event, the Spanish Armada, and it's called the Battle of Gravelines. So as we see, the fire ships had scattered the Armada. They're forced into the channel. They don't have that defensive formation, and the English could now attack them using their faster ships and their better guns to pick off the Spanish. The English attacked them, and the Spanish started to realise as they headed north that it was going to be too difficult to head back down the channel back to Spain. Really, it's clear once they're scattered in the channel that it's over. They're not going to be able to pick up the Duke of Parma's troops. All they can do is head for home. So the Spanish were forced to retreat north to try and get home round Scotland here. And this is where they encountered the Great Gale, this big storm around the coast of Scotland and Ireland. And what we see is Spanish ships floundering in the rough seas and being shipwrecked off the coast of Scotland and Ireland. Now, there's reports of Spanish sailors being shipwrecked and then coming ashore in Scotland and Ireland, particularly in Ireland. But as they came ashore, the Irish came down to the beaches and bludgeoned them to death on the beaches. So it wasn't a particularly warm welcome for them. The Armada then limped home back to Spain. Now, we're looking at sort of important reasons. Back to the weather. We started with the weather. We now have this Great Gale. So as the Armada headed north, they encountered this violent storm. Now, here you can see a medallion that Elizabeth had struck in commemoration of the Spanish Armada. Around it is a Latin inscription which says "Flavit et dissipati sunt." Now what that means is God blew and they were scattered. And this shows how important the weather was. It shows that the English ascribed their victory to the weather. But of course, they didn't think that was luck. They didn't think that the weather came along due to them just being lucky. They actually thought it was God's will. Look, here you can see at the top this wind being blown, and God blew and they were scattered. They're suggesting this is a Protestant wind that blew to blow away the evil Catholic Spanish. As I said, so yeah, the English believed it had sent a Protestant wind. The storm sank and damaged the Armada's remaining ships. So again, weather is an important factor. Now we think about 67 of the original 130 ships limped back to Spain, so not a very successful adventure. Other things we could look at are the excellent leadership of the English. In my previous video, I recited a bit of this speech. Elizabeth gave this fantastic speech at Tilbury, which kind of united the nation and inspired the troops to fight. Now, they never actually needed to fight, so I don't know whether we can put this down to being a real reason why the Armada failed, because they never managed to land. But it does show us that the English were united and had strong leadership. I think I have the speech here. I'm not going to read it again. You can look that up if you want. But let's just have a look at some of Philip's ideas and his plan, and actually just look at mistakes of the Spanish, because I think the Spanish did actually make mistakes, and there were many failures with Philip's plan. It had major flaws, major problems with it. Firstly, he hadn't really thought about a suitable port with which to pick up the Spanish troops. They were with the Duke of Parma in the Netherlands, and the idea was that they walk to Calais and then meet the Armada and somehow get on board. But they didn't have, there's not an effective harbour where they could all get onto the ships, and they didn't have enough barges to get them out. So this was a major flaw in the plan. Added to that, problems with communication and arranging this rendezvous, which really made this quite difficult to achieve for Philip. Of course, the coastline around the Netherlands is shallow. It's unsuitable for the large galleons that the Spanish were sailing. Even if they had managed to pick them up, transporting that large army across the Channel to England was going to cause major problems. The English were going to attack them with all their might. So that was going to be a major problem. I think Philip probably just had too much faith in the fact that this was his Catholic crusade and it was going to succeed. Now, even when his generals pointed out flaws in the plan, Philip ignored them. So we think Philip's plan in itself was a major reason for the failure of the Armada. Right, I'm going to go back. The only other thing I would say, which hasn't been mentioned here, is the leadership. I did mention it in my previous video, and that was the leadership of the Duke of Medina Sidonia, who was Philip's chosen admiral. Now, he was a poor leader at sea because he didn't have naval experience. He didn't want to do it. In fact, he even said he got seasick and caught colds at sea. So his choice as leader of the Armada was a mistake. And you compare that with the excellent leadership of the English. You have the inspirational Sir Francis Drake, who was fantastic. His troops loved him. He was extremely experienced at sea. If you compare the leadership of the two sides, there really was no contest. Right, I'm going to leave it there for now. I hope you've enjoyed this lesson, and I'll see you all again sometime soon.